Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video and welcome to episode 6 of the Underdogs of Raiding. Today we're going to talk about a spec that is more than an underdog. You see, an underdog spec is something that is unpopular, but some people try it out. This spec is something no one even bothered with. I'm talking about the Arcane Mage. And let me make myself clear, I'm not talking about Arcane Fire or Arcane Frost. No, I'm talking about full-blown Arcane. So, without further ado, let's once again travel back in time to 2004. So here we are at the early stages of the game, and this is the talent tree that mages had to work with. Now, anyone who would try it full Arcane will go with something like this. Most of the talents in Arcane, and maybe a few talents in Frost to give yourself a bit more survivability. So the Arcane tree itself had a lot of damage boosting abilities, such as Presence of Mind, Arcane Power, Evocation. Wait, what? Evocation? Oh yeah, that was a talent back in the day, not a skill any mage could get. So on paper things did look a little promising. So why did no one bother to go full Arcane? Well, the main source of damage for any full Arcane mage would be Arcane Missiles. But that spell on its own didn't nearly do enough damage, and thus mages often relied on frost damage, as fire was also out of the question due to the fact that mobs in Molten Core and Blackwing Lair were resistant to fire damage. Also, farming and grinding with frost was just way more simple. You didn't rely on channeling spells, you had way more defensive cooldown should you get to low health or encounter an enemy player who tried to gank you, and he was more mana efficient. So let's jump ahead to the later stage of vanilla. Did they acknowledge this problem and try to revamp the talents here? Well, no. Arcane still only had Arcane Explosion and Arcane Missiles as their two main spells, and they still bit the dust against any old Frost mage. And even later down the line, in Arcane Mirage and Naxx, fire would reign supreme due to the dot damage from Ignite. So before we move on to the expansions of World of Warcraft, we'll let our featured guest of this episode say a few words about the mage class and his personal experience. Who is that featured guest, you might say? Well, someone who played a mage way back in the day, someone who loves the class, and someone who's been on this channel before. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the one and only Dungeonjay.
Hey guys, Dungeonjay here. Today I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the iconic mage class. Hamsterwheel asked me to put together something a little small for him to talk and discuss about it, some of my experiences maybe. And I guess, really in a nutshell, talking about the mage class in general, you have to look at where it came from. It's very D&D centric. Now when I was a little boy, I used to play a lot of D&D down at the park, and I remember reading the series of the War of the Twins or something like that from Dragonlance, and there was an iconic mage character called Raceland in it. And he went through a lot of trials and tribulations, but anyway, it stuck with me. Now a lot of people may think about Gandalf, Gandalf the Grey or whatever, or the White. But Lord of the Rings never really resonated with me as much as D&D. And when you look at the product like Blizzard that is put out there back in 2004, they were really taking a lot of cues from like EQ, D&D, and the traditional fantasy tropes. So when you look at the mage character itself and you see the three different tier talents that you can pick from with the Arcane, the Frost, and the Fire, you can kind of see how they did the makeup on it. When you look at the Arcane class in general, it's more of a utility spec. At least initially, it was more of a utility spec. When you look at Fire and Frost, obviously they're the two different, hot and cold. Now, as far as why a lot of people didn't use like Arcane Missiles or did like an Arcane spec that was really heavy in raiding and vanilla, is there was a lot of changes throughout the patches. And also the Arcane spec was very heavy mana dependent. So a lot of people wouldn't select the Arcane class other than to dip into it for some of the stuff like Evo and, basically utility buffs. Or maybe if you were like an Arch Fire Mage or an Arch Frost Mage, something like that, you could actually dip into it for that reason back in vanilla. And also in addition to that, if I'm not mistaken, I believe in the early patches, Arcane Explosion had a cast time on it. So can you imagine running through a dungeon or a PvP or whatever, and you've seen it a million times where they're sitting there and they're using the Arcane Explosion and going pow, pow, but it had a cast time on it. So not only did they only have arcane missiles, but they only had arcane explosion on a cast time. So it was needless to say, a lot of people in the beginning probably were like, what the hell is the arcane spec? Why the hell would that even be in vanilla? But it was a very solid utility spec in the very beginning, and a lot of people dabbled into it for those reasons. And it's came a long way since then, but I'm sure Hamsterwheel will fill in the details about the arcane spec going forward. As for myself, I was always personally favorite of the Frost Mage. I started as a Fire Mage. I like that really like range, like fireball impact, you know, just the way it felt, right? I mean, that's a traditional mage, but watching videos or seeing what people were talking about as far as like the Frost Mage, made on the forums in general, made me decide to go ahead and switch to be a Frost Mage, and I really enjoyed that experience. It seemed like it was the most fleshed out character at that time, and especially in the TPC. But anyway, guys, Hamsterwheel will go ahead and continue on through this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and as always, have a great day gaming. Later.
And thank you for that, Dungeonjay. I think you really hit the nail on the head saying that Arcane was much more of a utility talent tree rather than something you'd smack all of your points in to do arcane damage. Also, if anyone is interested in Dungeonjay's content, you can find a link to his channel in the description below this video. And that pretty much sums up the vanilla era. A cool talent tree you'd spec into, but only to then boost the damage of either fire or frost. It's still a very memorable tree, as it made the whole 3-minute mage possible, as displayed by Doomhandle here, who could one-shot enemy players with one button. That's right, one button, dead. And now we arrive at the Burning Crusade era of the game. So here's the talent tree mages had in this expansion of the game. When you look at the arcane tree, not much has changed. You still have most of the abilities from vanilla, with a few extras like Spell Power, which gave you an additional 50% critical strike damage bonus, and Mind Mastery, which gave you 25 spell damage of your total intellect. But it wasn't these extra talents that made Arcane a bit more interesting. Oh no, it was the brand new offensive spell mages got, Arcane Blasts, which was quite an interesting spell back then. You see, with every Arcane Blast you would cast, you would get a buff on yourself that would increase damage and mana cost from the spell. It also stacked up to 4 times, so the more you cast the spell, the more damage it would do and the more mana it will cost. This skill was a total game changer for the Arcane Mage. Finally they had a spell that would be a solid damage output, and finally Arcane was more than just a tree to get those sweet cooldowns. So how did things fare for the Arcane Mage? Well, in the beginning it wasn't too great. Sure, spamming Arcane Blasts over and over again did a lot of damage, but you went out of mana way too soon if you weren't backed up by a Shadow Priest or a Druid who was willing to pass you an Innervate. Most of the time you had to balance things out with Frostbolt, just so you could let that increased mana cost buff run out and not burn through your mana too quickly. This combination of both Arcane Blast and Frostbolt was in itself a decent rotation with a decent damage output. But the problem was that there were other specs out there for the mage that were vastly superior in the early stages of the Burning Crusade, like Deep Fire for instance. I played a mage on the Phoenix Archangel server for quite a while, and I went through all the specs. You know, Deep Fire, Arcane Frost, Full Frost, and of course Full Arcane. What I noticed was that in Heroics and Tier 4 raids like Karazhan, Arcane was always lacking behind Deep Fire, which was often the preferred choice for any mage who was doing that type of content. However, there was one crucial set bonus that made Full Arcane a lot more competitive. That set bonus was found on the Tier 5 set, which would increase the damage and mana cost of Arcane Blast by 20%. Sure, that mana cost was kinda iffy, but 20% extra damage on a main offensive ability was huge. From that point on, Arcane became a serious competitor on the damage meters. Like I said earlier, it was still very important that you were backed up by at least a Shadow Priest and a Druid for Innervate, but if that was the case, Arcane could climb its way to the top of the damage meters, and with a little luck, it could even beat a Fire Mage or a Shadow Destro Warlock. As you can see, the Burning Crusade was a very important era for the Arcane Mage. The addition of Arcane Blast finally meant that you weren't laughed at if you gave it a go, though to be fair, Arcane is widely considered to only be competitive if you have that 2 set bonus from Tier 5. Still though, things were starting to shape up for the Arcane Mage, and from Tier 5 content and up, they were giving everyone a serious run for their money. And then we arrive at the third expansion of the game, which was Wrath of the Lich King. This is the talent tree mages got in this expansion, and in this expansion mages got another offensive ability, Arcane Mirage. Arcane Mirage was an instant cast that did a big amount of damage and was a good addition to any Arcane Mage's rotation. Though, to be fair, some mages decided to skip this talent because they thought the rotation was better without. Anyway, another thing that they decided to revamp was Arcane Missiles. You see, there were all these talents in the Arcane tree, yet no one decided to use that spell in their rotation in the Burning Crusade. But now, it was finally viable, due to the talent Missile Barrage. If you would smack 5 points in this, Arcane Blasts would have a 40% chance to reduce the channel duration of the next Arcane Missile spell by 2.5 seconds, reduce the mana cost by 100%, and missiles will fire every half a second. Basically, it gave you an Arcane Missiles on steroids. Naturally, because of this awesome talent, Arcane Missiles was now back into the rotation of Arcane Mages. It might have been gone for a very long time, but here it is again. So, with all these cool extra talents, how did things go for the Arcane Mage in Wrath of the Lich King? Well, for starters, they were no longer relying on a certain set bonus for them to be competitive, so that's definitely a plus. Speaking of competitive, Arcane in the early days of Wrath was actually one of the go-to specs for mages, as with that spec they would be very strong on the DPS meters through Naxx and Ulduar. Anyone who had the rotation down, spent time on getting some solid gear and brought some raid consumables would have a big chance of finding themselves in the top 5 of the damage meters, which is not too shabby at all if you ask me. Oh, one extra thing, they did make it unable to cast Presence of Mind while you had Arcane Power on you, and I guess they did that to get rid of the 3-minute one-shot specs that were very present in both Vanilla and Burning Crusade. Kind of a shame, as even though I understand, those specs were heaps of fun. Anyway, later in the game, they did kinda dip down in terms of position on the damage meters, as a Fury Warrior with Shadowmourne and some other goodies would beat them most of the time. But Arcane Mages were still going strong if played well. Mages have always been strong on the AoE too, and Wrath of the Lich King was no exception. Though, in all honesty, Balanced Druids were reigning supreme now that they had Starfall as their top tier talent. But I digress. Mages were a strong class in Wrath of the Lich King, and Arcane was a well-respected build. If you knew how to play one properly, you were a serious force to be reckoned with. From all the Underdog series I've done, this is probably the class that has progressed the most. They went from being a spec pretty much no one played with in both PvP and PvE, to a spec that was now a very strong competitor on the damage meters. A spec that was heaps of fun. A spec that shouldn't be messed with. A spec that in my opinion had Mage written all over it. And there you go folks, episode 6 of the Underdogs of Raiding. I'll be back with another video soon, but until then, I want to thank you for watching. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.